Liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, liebe Freunde des Amboss Studientelegramms, Marcus at Home goes international for the second time, and for the first time we will discuss in English. So just to avoid any misunderstanding, we are not planning to switch away from our German-speaking colleagues, so doctors, medical students, nurses in Austria, Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Germany. But we think it's very important from time to time to see beyond our own noses and to meet real global players in academic medicine and in clinical medicine. And therefore, also on behalf of my co-moderators, Dr. Schirmer, who is a cardiologist and university professor of internal medicine at Saarland University, and Anja Scheuer, who is a medical student also from Saarland University, it's a great privilege to have Dr. Howard Bauchner as our first US-American interview partner. Dr. Bauchner is a trained pediatrician, and he's for nearly 10 years editor-in-chief of JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is, along with the New England Journal, Lancet, and the British Medical Journal, one of the big four international journals in general and internal medicine. So, Howard, thanks for being with us on this very early Wednesday morning in Chicago.
Oh, it really is my privilege. It's odd for the tables to be turned where I'm being interviewed rather than I'm doing the interviewing, but that's okay. I've done a few of these.
So anyway, this is Conversation with Dr. Bauchner, isn't it?
Yes, that's right.
My name is Gunnar Heine. So.
From a different perspective.
I would like to start. So our interview shall mainly focus upon issues how medical education, how publishing changed in the last 12 months during this COVID-19 pandemic. What remained stable, which changes we saw, which we will see in the future. So I would like to start off by asking you, we saw in the last month a lot of information that has been spread on some online platform before undergoing peer review. So how do you think that this will affect the publishing in the future?
I'm not sure, Gunnar. You know, what you're talking about are press releases often from the recovery group, and then obviously preprint servers, which are becoming more popular in clinical medicine and have indeed grown exponentially over the last year. I'm not sure in the middle of a pandemic is the best time to try to evaluate the value of preprint servers. I think generally people are favorable towards them. I think there are real questions about what the purpose of preprint servers are in clinical medicine. I think that remains more unresolved than people think. Is it actually to get peer review? Is it to claim provenance over an article or an article type? Is it to disseminate information quickly? I'm not entirely sure that we always know what the goals of preprint servers are. Do I prefer an article on a preprint server to a press release? Yes. But I think much of the early worldwide interest in hydroxychloroquine was fueled by information on preprint servers that was never subject to peer review. That may have done harm. It's just hard to know. So I think the ultimate question is, do preprint servers improve patient outcomes? And I don't think we have a clear answer to that question. I do think there's models out there that we've seen that have worked effectively. And there's been much criticism of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, but virtually no criticism over the way in which the Moderna and Pfizer vaccine were approved and how the information was shared with the public. So, for example, the FDA gets a large report from either of the companies, and within a week or 10 days, they create a 20-page synopsis that is then shared with the public. And indeed, it's virtually the article. There's not much more information in the article than in that 20-page document. That is then openly discussed and debated in social media and in a live stream event. In some regards, for critical clinical trials, the same could be done rather than a press release. Take a week, write up a synopsis, and then share that synopsis publicly. In some regards, I suspect that's what a preprint server is meant to do. But you could also then engage in a live stream event so that people could have questions about what you've put out. So I actually think the FDA model around approval of the 2 vaccines to date may serve as a model for other drug trials that we think represent major therapeutic breakthroughs.
So within your own journal, do you think that JAMA will tend to shift more information to YouTube interviews, YouTube videos, because you did all these great interviews in the last months, met a lot of very important people, and actually these interviews inspired us to do something on a lesser scale here in Germany? Or will regular review articles remain the important ones upon which we will focus in the future?
So JAMA began doing videos and podcasts about 5 years ago after I arrived. But we thought in the midst of the pandemic that we really needed to increase and in some regards change the way in which we were conducting communication with our many users, in part because the public had become so interested in much of the JAMA content. And so that was really the genesis of the live stream events. And I've just been incredibly fortunate. Dr. Fauci's been on, I think, 10 times. Dr. Offit's been on 6 or 7 times. People seem to genuinely enjoy the 30, 35, 40-minute discussion between 2 health professionals that's civil, where there's questions and answers. It's truly a conversation. It meanders a bit. It's not confrontative. And the uptake's been rewarding. We've done about 60 of the live conversations, and they've been viewed about 20 million times. I think the one that I think is likely the most important is Mauricio Sacconi, who was who's president of the European Society of Critical Care Medicine, did one in March from Lombardy, and Mauricio said to the world, "You have no idea what's coming." I mean, he was in the midst of it. He had been up 24 hours. It looked like it. He was tired. But I think he galvanized the intensive care units around the world to understand that they had no idea what was going to happen in the next couple of weeks. And that was stunning to see the uptake of that video. And that then, obviously, a number I've done with Tony have been viewed many, many times because Dr. Fauci is in some regards, such a hero to much of the public in the United States. And then Ed Livingston and I have doubled the number of podcasts we've done. So I think we fully recognize that the way science is communicated needed to change. And we're now thinking about what the next year or 2 or 3 should look like around multimedia for JAMA and the JAMA network. We think we're going to build more events around the publication of very specific articles that we think are critically important. The only other one I would point out is we had a meta-analysis of 7 clinical trials around steroids. So the recovery trial had been reported, but that was a single trial. And there's many people in the evidence world who often say, 5 smaller trials may be as valuable as a single large trial for a host of different reasons. So we had 3 clinical trials. The meta-analysis and 4 others were included. And that was a live stream event with the WHO and 2 sets of authors. And I think that event and recovery really identified steroids as the treatment of choice. And we thought it was really important to communicate that worldwide. Steroids are inexpensive. It was a surprise, readily available around the world. I mean, some of the other drugs that have been talked about, the benefits have been marginal and they're not widely available.
What I would be interested in, Dr. Bauchner, is what's your thoughts on the quality of this kind of research? That's also, this is the pandemic that brings it about, and then at the same time we have the shift. We have had that for the last 10, 20 years almost towards social media, and there's the medical community. There's, say, professors and doctors and medical students, but there's also nurses and people who are, they don't read the New England Journal or the JAMA every week, but they tend to get their information very, very quick. And even I can realize myself that being busy during a busy schedule, as we cardiologists always think we are, that we tend to grasp this quick information. You know, all the journals now have graphical abstracts. Circulation, JAC, European Heart Journal, they have graphical abstracts, so we get information even quicker and quicker. But obviously, somebody has to make sure the quality is all right. And if things are just published, you know, on Facebook or something, who makes sure we're still dealing with decent science?
The notion of trusted sources may become even more important as we go forward. And we could spend the whole hour talking about social media and medicine, but we won't. But firstly, please just call me Howard. I'm perfectly fine with first names. So Stefan, you bring up a really provocative issue. What are trusted sources of information? You know, I'm blessed. You know, JAMA is over 150 years old and is considered one of the most influential, preeminent journals in the world. We've been very, very fortunate this year. We've had no retractions. We take great care with our articles. We've held up certain articles to fact check the results with authors because we were uncomfortable with them. But you're right, the communication has become shorter and quicker. And so the question is anything so-called lost in that translation? It likely is. This comes up oftentimes with the reporting of randomized clinical trials when people say, well, why don't you do it this way or do it that way? And I sometimes respond, you know, you actually have to read the entire article to understand what was done. I'm sorry, but we can't get it in 350 words. On the other hand, we've done visual abstracts on clinical trials. And I was at a major meeting and an author, showed it at the end. And I asked him, do you like the visual abstracts? He goes, well, on one hand, I love it, but do you realize you just summarized 5 years of work and $10 million on a single slide? He goes, in some regards, it's painful. So it's that tension between trying to help busy people get information more quickly, but on the other hand, individuals and people who are interested need to understand what lies below the surface of that visual abstract or that podcast. Again, the pandemic is so unique. I am not entirely sure we can make major conclusions about the future of scientific communication based upon the pandemic. I do know that public health is going to have to grapple with social media in a way that they didn't think of before. That issue is not going to go away. And just one last comment. Last year, JAMA had about 10,000 submissions. 2019, 2020, we had 22,000 submissions. So just as you and the clinical community was overwhelmed with the amount of information, so were journals. And we had to sort out efficient ways of trying to review that content to determine what we wanted to publish.
Funnily enough, we put on a number of questions that we were going to ask you, and then some of them you answered already now, talking about you even said you had 0 retractions. Is that true? That's obviously amazing. I mean, with that large number, maybe not so intensively reviewed papers, that's incredible. And you already said the number.
That was last year. I mean, you know, I'm not shy about retractions. People internally know. In some regards, I wear it as a badge of honor in the sense that journals have an enormous responsibility to publish an accurate medical record and then to correct the medical record, the medical history. Mm-hmm. So when journals have retractions, the journal editors shouldn't be dissuaded by that, nor should readers. Mistakes happen. Often, sometimes inappropriately, other times by accident. And what journals really need to do is to respond to that quickly. And I don't think any journal should ever be criticized for retracting papers. I think that's their obligation, and they're fulfilling their obligation to the medical community.
Yeah, that's right. What about, how do you, like in practice now, how do you deal with that very large and increasing number of journals? How did you increase editorial board? Does everybody just have a huge workload? Have you problems finding reviewers? I mean, we all know that, you know, you get more and more questions. Please look at that, and then, yeah.
So we changed our triage. Normally articles come in let's talk about original research and then opinion. So original research usually comes in and is triaged to the appropriate editor. Infectious disease articles would go to Preeti Milani. Critical care manuscripts would go to Derek Angus or Chris Seymour. And then they in turn would evaluate whether that paper should go out for external peer review. Cardiology papers would go to Phil Greenland or Greg Kerfman. We changed that process early on. So the first 3 or 4 major papers we published were straight epidemiology from China, from Italy, from France, and from the US. Because of the importance of getting out information quickly, we reviewed those papers internally. Now we have 8 full-time physicians and associate editors who work for us part-time. So we were able to review those papers internally. They did not go out for external peer review, but believe me, internal peer review at JAMA is probably more stringent than external peer review. But those are counting exercises, okay? So we reviewed those internally. Those were the first sets of articles. Now there's 1 or 2 exceptions. We had a research letter on asymptomatic spread in February, and this had followed a publication in New England Journal that was quickly called into question about whether or not the individual who was the index case was truly asymptomatic. Ultimately, it was resolved to suggest that that person was asymptomatic, although I think there remains some discussion and debate about that. That paper went out for external peer review, and then we double-checked with the authors about the index case because we recognize the importance of what that was going to say. So we actually held that paper up for 2 weeks. We knew it was important, okay? And if there's one thing I would change was that we should have had a banner headline in the journal saying asymptomatic spread is occurring, because I think the world may have masked more quickly. So for the month of March, in every major city, people who were asymptomatic got on the underground, the subway, the metro. And I don't think much of the world outside of Asia really began masking until March, and we could have done it sooner, and that's a regret. In any case, early on, the papers were reviewed internally, but as soon as we began to get more important epidemiologic work or more complicated epidemiologic work, and then obviously clinical trials, they all went out for external peer review. But we are fortunate, and I absolutely have to thank the critical care and infectious disease communities. We would often ask, when we thought the papers were important, like the 3 steroid papers, we would ask for peer review in 2 days. And inevitably, people would stop what they were doing and do the peer review in 2 or 3 days. Now, we rejected 95, 98% without review. Okay, so we became very focused on initially epidemiology, interesting issues around epidemiology, and then moving into therapy, diagnosis and therapy, and clinical trials. And I think all of the major journals have made that transition. So all those papers came to me, all original investigations came to me, so I could understand what we were seeing. And then I would triage them, either rejected, or I would ask for internal consults about whether or not people thought they were important. And then 8 or 10 of us met every Wednesday to discuss a number of papers. Research letters went to Jody Zelke, as they always have. Pieces of my mind, our opinion, our narrative pieces went to Preeti Milani, and then Phil Fontana Rose and I handled all viewpoints. And so we did change our triage, and that triage system has stayed in place till this day. March was difficult. We had over 125 submissions a day. I spent most days just reading, but someone jokingly said, well, you're not traveling, so you have a lot of time on your hands. You know, I haven't traveled. I usually travel extensively in the United States and around the world. So I did save time from not traveling. So it just meant a lot of reading every day. And for me, I felt lucky. It was a privilege to read great science and to understand what issues were evolving over time. So it was a great deal of work, but I think everyone at JAMA just feels like it's the way we tried to contribute to the broader understanding of what was occurring.
I need to say thank you there, because that's so interesting, the way you're actually turning it around. We've been asking critical questions about how do you uphold quality and everything, but you stress and underline the importance of the contribution of a journal like JAMA for the public and for the worldwide, everything that's actually going on, because that's obviously the same. The other side of the medal, really, that you need to be quick and make sure information gets to the world quickly. One last question from my side. We're only talking about pandemic at the moment. How does this huge number of articles, how did that affect the rest of the rest of internal medicine, which is still huge, obviously? Yeah. How much has that decreased a number of publications? How much has you focused because you needed to publish everything that's dealing with COVID-19? How does that affect the other fields?
It's so interesting that you asked that, Stefan, because we just, at the end of December and then into January, we get the end of the year numbers. So we saw, I call it the numbers. So in 2019, JAMA had about 33 million views of its content, okay? Last year, we had 68 million views of our print content and another 25 million views of our videos and our podcasts. So just around 100 million views uptake of our content. Almost 80% of that is focused on COVID-19. Mm-hmm. So we know the thirst for the information around COVID-19 dwarfed everything else we published. And in some regards, we've published important articles last year, but they're lost. And we're working on a system of trying to resurface them for the clinical community. We published an incredibly important randomized clinical trial, cardiology trial by Steve Nissen and others about, you probably are aware of it, but it sort of got buried. And so we have to figure out a way of how to resurface that content over the course of the year. We, in fact, jokingly last week, we got a report from the CDC about anaphylaxis related to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. And we had already published the Moderna data, but now we had the Pfizer data, and it's in 2 columns, so you can compare one to the other. Very rare events, all in women. And we said, well, would people be interested in it? It has almost 300,000 views in 2 days, okay? So there's still an incredible amount of interest. And in the next day or so, we will be publishing a clinical trial on a question that people have asked for the last 9 or 10 months. I don't want to break our own embargo, but it is a question about a therapeutic maneuver around COVID that people have asked essentially since February.
All right.
Hello from me as well, and I was wondering if, as the Journal of the American Medical Association, if you feel like you have to focus more on US-based medicine as opposed to the rest of the world or Europe, and has that shifted at all lately?
So firstly, JAMA is editorially independent of the American Medical Association. So in some regards, and it's interesting if you compare the 4 journals that were mentioned earlier. So Lancet is owned and operated by Elsevier, but independent, obviously, of Elsevier. And I think it would be difficult for anyone to tell Richard Horton what to do. We're friends, and he's an extraordinary individual. The Mass Medical Society owns New England Journal of Medicine, but Mass Medical Society is a very small society in comparison to the journal. The journal is the Mass Medical Society in some regards. That's very different from me and Fee Godley. Fee has a relationship with the British Medical Association, which is a strong group, and my association, the JAMA, is owned by the American Medical Association. But I have editorial independence for editorial matters. I don't report to anyone at the AMA, and I have been blessed. The AMA has been fantastic during the 10 years I've been here. They've never said one word to me about what we published, and if they did, I probably wouldn't listen, so that's okay. But they've been a fantastic partner. 40 or 45% of our content is from outside of the United States. So I think, like the other journals you mentioned, we really think of ourselves as an international journal. more than 40% of the authors are from outside the US. And in this case, around COVID-19, the majority of important clinical trials have been done outside of the United States, and that's an entirely different issue, okay? But if you look at the series of steroid trials that we published, the 3 corticosteroid trials and then the meta-analysis, the 3 corticosteroid trials were all done outside of the United States. And I think the clinical research community in the US needs to understand what it did well and what it didn't do well over the last 9 or 10 months. That's a complicated issue. So I think specifically to answer your question, JAMA thinks of itself as an international journal. Our social media reaches now about 1.5 million people worldwide. And we know from looking at downloads that more than half of our uptake is outside of the United States.
Okay. And talking about submissions, have you noticed a shift there as well towards more global way?
Yeah, there's been a tremendous uptick in the number of submissions from Asia and from some Middle East countries. That is new. In part, I think that reflects where there had been a great deal of disease. So where there was more disease, there was a chance to conduct more research. The same would be true in Europe. So that would be France, Italy, Spain, and the United Kingdom. So indeed, you are correct in surmising that there's been a slight shift in where the articles have come from. I haven't quite yet looked at the distribution of what we published, but I would expect a greater shift to outside the US and Canada in comparison to previous years.
So maybe we would continue with some, questions beyond editorship itself, because about 2 or 3 other items we would be interested in. So you're a pediatrician. My wife actually is a pediatrician, and she would be anxious to ask you something. So I think the role of children, adolescents is quite difficult. So they are barred from schools, universities. They are sometimes considered as virus spreaders. At the same time, they are not yet included into these vaccination trials. So what are your ideas of, as a pediatrician, and surely as, if I got it right, father of a teacher and even great father already, if I'm not mistaken?
Excellent, Gunnar. Yes, I am a pediatrician. One of my sons is a teacher, and my other son is a mental health specialist. So much to say about children. The first is that the risk of serious disease we know is very low. It's MISC, I think, is the eponym. We just published an observational cohort study about treatment options. People are waiting for clinical trial data, but they're probably 6 months or a year away. And this compared IVIG and steroids versus steroids alone, and IVIG plus steroids on 5 or 6 very important outcomes was far superior. That's obviously for critically ill patients. I think when you talk about children, one has to think about prepubertal and postpubertal children, because for many clinical conditions, the 15, 16, and 17-year-old look and behave much more like 25-year-olds. So I do think there's this difference between prepubertal and postpubertal children. With respect to vaccines, there are now 2 or 3 ongoing clinical trials that are enrolling younger and younger adolescents in clinical trials. I think people would be amazed or surprised if the immunologic response in 15, 16, and 17-year-olds is any different than the immunologic response in 20, 25, or 28-year-olds. The same with side effects or adverse events. I think we won't do large clinical trials, but I think people are just particularly interested in immunologic trials. And I think those data will be quite consistent. I think for the prepubertal children, I think there's more unknown, in part because it's clear that ACE receptors, likely in the nose, vary with age. And it may be in part why young children seem to get a little or mild disease. There's the exceptions, but they get little or mild disease. And it may have to do with ACE inhibitors in the nose. And so I'm particularly interested in clinical trials in prepubertal children. There, I am not sure that we can be clear or expect the same immunologic response. Obviously, by every metric, Germany has done far better than the United States. And I think that reflects your healthcare system and remarkable leadership. Something that obviously the US really struggled with over the last year. Inconsistent public health messages, a president who really didn't champion a single or two individuals to be the consistent presenter of evidence and public health messages, despite Dr. Fauci's enormous attempts over the year to deliver a consistent message. It was a struggle, and I think people have recognized that. Schools have become tremendously complicated in the US, I think for two or three reasons. People know that it's likely safe for the majority of children to be educated in person. But the question is it safe for teachers? And is it safe when those children go home? Those have been the two great unknowns. I think the data over the last 3 to 6 months has suggested that children don't represent super spreader events, and that it is likely safe for children and safe for children who live with parents who may be at higher risk. I think there's still some uncertainty about teachers who could be at high risk. So in the United States, the Centers for Disease Control just released, I think it's a 60-page document about trying to get people back to school in person, not this Zoom, in-person Zoom, that back and forth. And it's under current debate. It really has been a struggle in the United States. I don't know what's happened to Germany. I don't think there's any clear answers. I think the real question aren't the children. The real question are teachers, and then where do those children live? But the data suggests they are not super spreader events.
You've published several papers on vaccine acceptance lately, and in Germany, it feels like people at first, around Christmas maybe, were very reluctant to get vaccinated at all, but now that the vaccine, that they're actually rolling out, they're more anxious to get vaccinated, maybe because of the natural scarcity effect, and everyone wants something that's rare and that's hard to get. But how do you see that playing out in the US?
What an interesting question about. I just saw someone sent me a piece about vaccine acceptance worldwide, which was interesting. Now, I always take surveys. I'm always a bit disbelieving with surveys because you don't know who responded, who didn't, and responding rates in surveys has plummeted. So if you have a 30% responding rate, it's probably not representative of that country. You don't know if people who are less likely or more likely to respond. You just don't know. And so part of the struggle with survey results is that the responding rate has generally declined over the last 10 or 20 years. People just don't want to respond. In the best of the representative surveys in the US, we know that so-called vaccine acceptance has gone up over the last 3 or 4 months. And I think you mentioned one or two really important reasons about reasons likely why. First, when you make something inaccessible, sometimes the normal human response is to say, I want it. So I think that in some regards has helped. I mean, I'm curious about if the J&J vaccine gets approved and it's 70% effective, if there's going to be this huge national debate, do you get Moderna and Pfizer versus J&J? And someone said we set the bar too high with Moderna and Pfizer at 95%. If you had said it was 70%, it would have been easier. But we'll see how human nature deals with that question. So scarcity. Secondly, I think the FDA, as I already mentioned, did just an extraordinary job in holding to their process of vaccine approval. And there was a huge debate in July and August and September and October, the run up to the presidential campaign. What was the FDA going to do? And Peter Marks and Steve Hahn, Steve, the former commissioner of the FDA, deserve just an enormous amount of credit. This is the goalposts. This is our process. We will make it transparent and we will let the public know how we've done it. They did all of those things. And so there's been almost no criticism in the US, about the FDA approval process. So that relieved one great barrier around vaccine acceptance. You have the scarcity issue. I think because of the legacy of racial inequality in the United States, there continues to be a large percent of the Black community that is vaccine hesitant. And there's been an enormous number of initiatives, local initiatives, about trying to provide education for individuals and opportunity to be vaccinated. Two issues have occurred. How do you sign up? Okay. And do you understand what vaccination means? And both things have to occur simultaneously. So if I finally got vaccinated, it took me 5 hours on the internet checking different sites before I could figure it out. So I did it late at night. But you had to be pretty savvy. You had to have access to a high-speed internet. You had to have the time. That's not available for everyone. So we know that we have to do a much, much better job at giving people opportunity to sign up and to talk with them about the benefits of vaccination. Ultimately, people have a right to say no. I really want to be clear. I mean, at some point, we have not mandated vaccines in the U.S. So when people will say, well, look at the disparities between groups, after you educate people and you give them opportunity, I have to remind myself that people have a right to say no for whatever reason. That's their right. I think people are guardedly optimistic that ultimately 75 or 80% of individuals will be willing to accept the vaccine. We know we have the anti-vacciners, that's 1 or 2%. They will never accept the vaccine. Vaccine hesitancy, based upon the WHO last year, had reached about 20 or 25% in the world. I think the question is, how do we move that 20 or 25% to be comfortable with vaccines? I think the anti-vacciners, we likely can't move them. And this goes back to a question that Stefan raised. This is where we don't understand social media. And we have to do a better job in public health in engaging in social media. There is no choice. This debate is not occurring in the popular press, your leading print publications on radio or TV. It's occurring in social media. And at least in the US, the Centers for Disease Control is fabulous at public health messaging in traditional media. What they need to figure out is how to talk in social media. I don't know how to do it, but I know that is an incredibly important part of communication as we go forward.
Do you see a role there for the JAMA at all? Not in social media particularly, but switching a little bit from a pure scientific journal, and obviously you do that already with the videos and YouTube and everything, because access is obviously there for a broader public. Is there a political role of a journal like the JAMA?
I wouldn't call it a political role, and I'll return to that in a bit. So when I first arrived, we changed kind of the mix of article types. We stopped book reviews, for example. They were taking up a lot of time and space, and no one was reading them. And we've got hundreds of books. It filled our library. I didn't know what to do with all the books. But we stopped that. We added short synopses of guidelines. No one reads 100-page guidelines, so we have a guideline synopsis. People love it. That's what I had done in my former position as an editor-in-chief. So we've created a lot of short article types. Ed Livingston, Mary McDermott oversee that section. I wanted to drop the patient page, and that would have been a huge mistake. And so we looked at our numbers. We really try to make decisions based upon numbers. That was, without doubt, our most outwardly reaching public face, which was our patient pages. And Stefan, in response to your question specifically, we've done many videos now that are really for the public, and they have largely been around vaccines. And we're lucky. Depending on where or how YouTube displays it, they can have millions of hits. YouTube has become a very important conveyor of information by video. We also use Twitter Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. I can go on and on. So we are on all the major platforms. Mike Berkowitz has done a great job. But this year we have created more videos that are absolutely focused on trying to educate the public around diagnosis, testing, and now particularly the vaccines. That I think is an important role that we have. Whether we should endorse candidates for the presidency or support one person for the FDA versus another person, that's not what I see as our particular role. I want to encourage civil discussion and debate. And that may represent more conservative views or more liberal views. What we've lost in the US is an ability to have civil conversation. And I am just enormously concerned about that as we go forward.
I have one more question about medical education, being a medical student. How have you, how do you feel has it affected well, being in medical school, but maybe being an intern or starting as a young doctor? What are the disadvantages, but what are also the benefits? Like I love the podcast and how much great information is out there, easily accessible.
What an unbelievably chaotic year for medical students. I feel for them. It's just been a tremendously chaotic year. I've spoken to dozens of them, and you know, it depended a bit. Like in the US, you know, I think we have year 1, 2, 3, and 4. Years 1 and 2 are often in the lab, small group, and then years 2, 3 are usually clinical years, and then year 4 is searching electives and doing residency. And I think last year, so, you know, the pandemic occurs in February, March. For year 1, many of them would have been through their live event anatomy. So most of them then moved to Zoom classes. So that was okay last year for first years. For first years this year, anatomy wasn't occurring in person because most classes had been by Zoom. Okay. Year 2, both this year and last year is pretty adaptable by Zoom. So I think year 2s have been affected the least. Years 3 and the clinical years, most were removed from clinical rotations last March, April, and May. And so I think it was incredibly disruptive. And then obviously when travel got restricted in the US in year 4, they often go to other places to see them, to interview, to do rotations. That all ended. So I think year 1 last year, probably okay. Year 2's okay. Years 3, the clinical year, very difficult. Years 4, if they had gotten in their rotations before March and April, that was good. But this year, year 4 can't travel. There's been a lot of other changes in education in the U.S. A lot of the major board tests that they do, part 1 and part 2 of the boards have gone to pass-fail from scoring. So there's been some other major changes. I have jokingly said we have pandemic births, we have pandemic weddings. My son's wedding went from 115 people in Maine to his mother-in-law's backyard with 15 people. Such is life. It's fine. But I think everyone in medical school during 2020 will say I'm a pandemic medical student in some regards, because it's been so disruptive. I really feel for them. I just don't. I think every school's really tried to do a good job, but it's been very, very difficult, particularly in trying to select residencies because they can't travel and all the interviews are by Zoom. The only other thing, and I just did a session with medical students the other night. If I had to do my career all over again, I would become a doctor. It is the greatest privilege of my life.
I agree. Well, I'm not a doctor yet, but I hope that when I am, I can say the same. And maybe as a final question, a question that I actually stole from you. is what surprised you most in the last year during this pandemic, either socially, scientifically, or academically?
Yeah. I in hindsight, I probably could anticipate it, but the political rancor around science in the U.S., the extent of the political rancor in the U.S., I think surprised me, and it hasn't gotten better. You know, that's really disturbing to me. I like American football. I couldn't believe that there were 30,000 people at the Super Bowl. I was just amazed, and that people didn't question it, or very few people questioned it. In the U.S., I think the inability to mount a single public health message that would be acceptable to 80 or 90% of the people. There would always be outliers, but the political rancor and involvement in science, I think surprised me, and profoundly disappointing, with just huge consequences. I mean, we probably have 500,000 excess deaths in the U.S. in 2020 compared to 1918 and 17. The final numbers will come in. About 2/3 of those are attributable to COVID, but there's other reasons why people died. So the excess deaths could be more than World War II. Worldwide, I've been surprised how well some countries have done and how poorly other countries have done. Great research has come out of the United Kingdom. I give them all the credit in the world, but their deaths per million are greater than the US. So somehow all that great research didn't convert to better clinical outcome. It's extraordinary to me. I just looked at the data. So their clinical research enterprise was remarkable, but their clinical and public health response wasn't. Very similar to the US in terms of deaths per million. Not surprised about the success of Singapore, Korea, Taiwan, but those countries in some regards have the ability that we don't have in the US. So they can really track people by phones. They have a different relationship around what represents privacy. We can't do that in the United States. So the tracking, tracing, testing that those countries used was almost impossible in the US, and our lack of public health infrastructure. I applaud Canada. I applaud Germany. You were faced with the same issues that we were faced with, and your deaths per million, which is the number I really look at, are much lower. Fascinating to see Norway, Finland, Denmark, and Sweden, that great Swedish experiment that appears to have failed. Okay, their deaths per million far exceed Norway, Finland, and Denmark. Why has Belgium done so poorly? So there's just such interesting epidemiologic data. Obviously, the great scientific achievement of the 21st century is the development of 2 vaccines in 1 year. It's a remarkable achievement. Tony Fauci had written about this 3 years ago in JAMA, about getting vaccine development down to 2 years. I remember our first interview in February. I said, Tony, how quickly? He said, at the earliest, 2021. And he had to revise that. So the great scientific achievement of vaccine development, both in the US, Germany, the UK, around the world. I think people are amazed about Sputnik from Russia. Hopefully safety is not an issue, but it appears not to be. Great achievement by the Russians. No clear therapeutic approach has worked other than steroids. I think antivirals haven't really worked. The IL-6 inhibitors, some success, but marginal, not for everyone. I think no major therapeutic breakthroughs has been a surprise other than corticosteroids. And then the last is, from a physiologic standpoint, this virus acts so uniquely, potentially, on so many different systems. It's not a respiratory pathogen in the traditional sense of the word. It really can make people very critically ill. And obviously the early issues about ventilation, keeping people off ventilators, ventilating them on their back rather than on their stomach, giving them all these additional early treatments to prevent being intubated because they seem to be on the ventilator for so long. And then just two final answers. When I first heard the term long haulers, I said, why are people telling me about truck drivers? I was so naive. I had never heard it before. So someone said, Howard, what do you think about these long haulers? And I thought to myself, why are people asking me about people who drive trucks for long? And so there was this funny exchange. I think this was back in April. And I read all the time. And so I don't think we really understand the entity, how common it is, what does it really mean, what does it mean physiologically, and then ultimately, will there be treatments? And then the last is every country has become nationalistic around vaccines. That includes your country, my country. President Biden announced he just secured 300 million more doses for the US. He didn't say one word about what he secured for the rest of the world. The virus doesn't really care if you're in Germany or whatever country's next to Germany. Guess what? It goes back and forth. And so ultimately, the world has to grapple with a vaccination program that's global. And we have yet to do that. I mean, there's different consortiums have been developed. But, the Chinese vaccine is going to emerge in certain countries, the Sputnik vaccine and others. Moderna and Pfizer are largely going to be confined to high, maybe middle-income countries, in part because of the way in which it needs to be delivered. It's just going to be difficult. But for the 3 or 4 billion people who live in low and middle-income countries, we have to figure out a global vaccination approach. Otherwise, this pandemic could be with us. And then, I'm sorry, truly the last comment is the emergence of variants. We've published on it extensively. I'm interviewing Rochelle Walensky, the head of the CDC, later today about the U.S. approach to variants. People are very, very concerned that a truly malignant variant will emerge, generally resistant to all of the vaccines. And so that has precipitated a whole new approach to the science of vaccines. And I think just over the last 2 or 3 weeks, it's very, very clear that this is of enormous concern around the world, and whether or not, COVID-19 is going to end up looking like flu, where one needs to be vaccinated on a regular basis with whatever is emerging. We haven't done very well vaccinating people now, so you can imagine how difficult that would be. So I think that's one of the great scientific questions, current scientific questions.
Gunnar, any more questions?
Well, I think we are very grateful to all your replies you gave to us. We saw behind you that while we started, it was quite dark. Now, apparently in Chicago, there's some sunlight. So we took a lot of your time, but it was really a great pleasure for us. And thanks for all your work, and looking forward to watching you in your next videos. You mentioned the one that will be sent out tonight, and hopefully many of our colleagues here in Germany, Switzerland, Austria will follow that. So thanks a lot from my side.
Thank you from my side also. It's been really a long time that I've looked or stared at a screen and listened to a speaker for an hour with such fascination, and really we're privileged for having had that today with you. Thank you so much. Indeed, seeing the sun go up or getting daylight, your place made it even more special. So thank you very much indeed, Howard.
My pleasure. It was interesting to have the tables turned, and I tried to answer the question. It drives me crazy in my conversations when people go on either too long or don't answer the question. So I really tried to answer the questions.
You did.
And stay healthy. And really, Germany has done really well. Congratulations to your country.